Good evening. I hope you had a pleasant enough afternoon, able to enjoy it the way that you intended, and I appreciate you being here tonight. I want you to. Esther just lost her candy, and I didn't know where it went, and I found it. It was on the bottom of my shoe. So now that everybody's thoroughly distracted, let's get into the Bible. This is going to be our last in the series of women, 7 women recorded for us in the Bible that are barren. And the last one that we're looking at is Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist. And we're going to look at the first chapter of Luke and also at the first chapter of John. We're going to start in Luke and then we'll end in John for a reason we'll get to in just a few moments. But when you think about John the Baptist, you think about a central figure in the grand scheme of the biblical narrative, of what was necessary, of what was coming. John the Baptist was pivotal in all that God was trying to accomplish. And all that comes from a woman that was barren. A woman that was advanced in years, as was her husband and many others that we've talked about. But this is a woman that never lost hope, it doesn't seem, in this regard. The story of Elizabeth and the story of her pregnancy, in particular, what we're going to focus on is her pregnancy here in Luke chapter 1, is remarkable, to say the least. You remember Zechariah goes in to what was his job, and he goes into the temple and he begins his service, and then he is greeted with this angel with the message that you're going to have a son, which he found hard to believe. And his question was, if you remember, what proof do you give me that these things are going to be so? Right? I'm not going to go home and tell my wife, here's the wisdom. I'm not going to go home and tell my wife that she's going to be pregnant if she's not actually going to be pregnant. So the proof was, you're not going to be able to talk. Probably not what he was looking for, but nonetheless, that was the proof that was given to him, that he wasn't going to be able to talk. And then we have the birth being foretold about John, what we have come to know him as John the Baptist. And in this conversation that he's having with this angel in verses 14, 15, 16, and 17 is where we're going to read. But her pregnancy was a pregnancy that we see of purpose. Like there is a direct intention of what she was going to do, of what John was going to do, and what the Lord was trying to accomplish. It was a pregnancy of purpose, okay? And read with me, beginning in verse 15, 16, and 17, and look at what it says here. For he, the one she's going to be pregnant with, for he will be great before the Lord. He must not drink wine or strong drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb. And he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. And he will go before him in the spirit of the power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and to the disobedient to wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared. You talk about a purpose. I mean, this is a purpose, right? It's somewhat vaguely but very directly defined. He is preparing the way, and he's going to have the power of Elijah. And the purpose, right? He's going to be a Nazarite from his birth. Like, don't drink any wine or strong drink. He is going to be solely devoted to this purpose. And it says he's going to be given the Holy Spirit, right, from his birth. I mean, how cool is this whole thing, right? And you're hearing this for the first time. You're Zechariah talking to this angel. What? This has got to be one of those moments that echoes for generations through the household. Right? I mean, how incredible is this? But it's a pregnancy on purpose. It's a pregnancy for purpose. It's not an accident or an oops, right? I know many of you and have told me, we'll go there, that sometimes we have children by accident. Okay, it doesn't work that way. But I was an accident, right? I was the fourth one, and my mother cried when they told her that she was pregnant with a fourth child. She's still crying. But this is not one of those. I mean, he's got a job to do. And read it. I mean, let it simmer. He will be great before the Lord. He must not drink wine or strong drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb. And he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. After 500 years of silence, where we've been asking, where is God? All of a sudden, John the Baptist will emerge on the scene, and he's going to turn many people's hearts to God, and they're going to be able to understand, God hasn't left us. It's a purpose. It's a pregnancy on purpose. To make ready, to summarize it all, at the end of verse 17, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared. This is deep. And this is a powerful pregnancy. But it's also this pregnancy that she's going through and that she's experiencing, for 9 months, just like everybody else. It's unlike that. It's a pregnancy of prophecy, right? Because if you back up and you pay attention to verse 15, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit. And certainly he was. I mean, you look at the ministry of John, and there it is, and he is full and certainly guided by the Holy Spirit. There's no denying that. But if you go and look what was happening just a little over 6 months from now, the mother of Jesus, or the to-be mother of Jesus, Mary arrives at her cousin Elizabeth's house, and you remember, in my mind, there is only one way to explain the events of verse 41. Look at what it says. And Elizabeth, right? Elizabeth heard the greeting of Mary. The baby leaped in her womb. In my mind, there's only one way to describe what just happened. To our knowledge, Mary hadn't been there before, and there's no reason for this baby that is, right, it's in the belly, no reason for that baby to recognize the voice of Mary. But when Mary arrived, knock, knock, this leap. I mean, there's this overwhelming feeling in the belly. Never had a baby, but I can only imagine what that's like. Behold, the baby has leaped in my womb. And notice it says, leaped. It's not, well, the baby kicked me when you came. We're three months out from delivery. This is a big motion. How do you explain something like that? There's only one way in my mind, and it's through the Spirit. But if you back up before you get to verse 15, then he will be filled with the Holy Spirit. In verse 14, it says, and you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth. And undoubtedly that was the case. Because if you flip over, this is another prophecy in verse 15, fulfilled in verse 57, because when Elizabeth gave birth, she bore a son. And in verse 58, her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown great mercy to her, and the prophecy is fulfilled. And they rejoice. And they rejoice. It's fulfilled. The whole, and we begin to see it play out, that this is exactly as God intended. And all these things, as you can imagine, Zechariah and Elizabeth experiencing, obviously for the first time, but they're starting to see the puzzle pieces fit together. This is on purpose. God has a specific plan for this boy. On purpose, the prophecy. But there's also, through the mix, there's also this hunch, this premonition, if you will, that people are beginning to wonder. Because you remember, Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, couldn't speak. They didn't know an explanation other than what certainly he's seen an angel. And 8 days after John the Baptist's birth, the time came for them to name him. And everyone supposed, well, let's just read it in verse 63. Everyone supposed that he was going to be named Zechariah. But look at this, or after one of his relatives. And he asked for a writing tablet in verse 63 and wrote, his name is John. And they all wondered. They're holding that in their mind. And immediately his mouth was loosed and his tongue became loosed and he spoke, blessing God. And fear, they wondered. Now we're in fear, verse 65. And fear came on all their neighbors. And all these things were talked about through all the hill country of Judea. And all, verse 66, all who heard them laid them up in their hearts, saying, what then will this child be? For the hand of the Lord was with him. They've got a hunch. Even from his birth, they've got a hunch. When the time came for him to be named, now we've got a bigger hunch. You know why? Because God's got a purpose. The prophecy has to be fulfilled. All of this comes back to, for John, he's got a specific purpose for God, a specific role to fill. Obviously, we know that John the Baptist was the one that was preparing the way for Jesus to come, preparing people's hearts, getting them ready for Jesus to be successful in his own ministry. And if John had never have done this, the way wouldn't have been paved. Not the way that it was supposed to in fulfillment of prophecy. And if Elizabeth had been fruitful, if she had a lot of kids, would this have been special? Not nearly as special. Would these people have been gathered around and rejoicing over Elizabeth? Finally, you have a child. Not nearly as excited. And would these people have wondered, what's going to be of this boy? Not nearly in as much awe as they undoubtedly were. All of this is according to the plan, God using again yet another barren woman for his divine purpose. Well, let's go over to John chapter 1, and let's turn our attention now to this child that is now grown up, John the Baptist, and look in particular at his ministry. And we're looking at John chapter 1 because this is, John does a beautiful job in writing to us less sophisticated people. But what is said here in John chapter 1 about John the Baptist is one of my favorite texts in regards to what John did, how he lived, and what he was all about. Let me get there. John chapter 1, and we're actually going to start here in verse 19. Right after we get describing Jesus is eternal, right? I mean, John chapter 1, verse 1. Jesus is eternal. Jesus has always been. We get into John the Baptist. And this is the testimony of John, verse 19. When the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" he confessed and did not deny, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." What you see right off the bat, the first thing that you notice about John the Baptist is his selflessness. John the Baptist was a man who was in and out 100% selfless. He confessed and did not deny, "I am not the Christ." You remember, and I bring this up to draw your attention to what Gamaliel says later on. About 4 or 5 years later, Jesus has been crucified. Gamaliel, a prominent member of the Pharisee sect, you remember what he says during the trial of Peter and the other apostles. This is Acts chapter 5, beginning in verse 35. And this is just a side note. But listen to this. They were wondering whether they should put these men to death or not, the apostles to death or not. This is what Gamaliel says, verse 35. And he said to them, "Men of Israel, take care what you are about to do with these men. For before these days, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After him, Judas, the Galilean, rose up in the days of the census and drew away some people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered. So in the present case," he says, "let these men alone. For if this is the plan, this undertaking of this man, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found to be opposing God." Here's the point. I want to bring your attention to this. There were other people that claimed to be the Christ before Jesus came. And they drew other people away with him. But John, having the opportunity, he had people asking him, "Are you the Christ?" And that fact, he did not deny it, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." He had the opportunity to have this great following, and how many of us would take that fame and prestige and just absolutely run with it? But his selflessness shines through. We also see his purpose, the purpose that he had. And I find this remarkable. And bewildering at the same time. Did his mother and father talk to him and tell him what he was supposed to do? Or was he led by God in the way that God leads us? Or was it a divine leading? A supernatural leading? It's interesting because read this with me in verse 22 and verse 23. So they said to him, "Who are you? We need to give an answer to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" He said, "I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, 'Make straight the way of the Lord,' as the prophet Isaiah said." Now, naturally, we're inclined to go over to Isaiah. At least I am. And you see and find in Isaiah chapter 40 these words beginning in verse 3. It says this, "A voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Our God, lift every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. 3 through 5. Isn't that incredible? And this is exactly what, nearly verbatim, I am the voice crying out in the wilderness. Make straight the way of the Lord. Wow. Isaiah, if you remember, about 700 years before John comes on the scene. But you think about, as a side note here, you think about God preparing the way for the Lord. I mean, or Jesus, the Messiah, the one that's going to come, right? And you would think, hey, we need to prepare him a way similar to the triumphal entry, right? Let's put him in the most prominent city where he's going to be the most recognized and where everybody is going to flock to him. And we want as many people to see him as possible, right? I mean, publicity, publicity, publicity. But look at where this starts. A voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. That's not where you would expect to start a movement that's going to take over the world, is it? But often what God calls us to do is to come out into the wilderness, to leave our comfort zones, and to follow after him, to make that conscious, intentional choice to follow after him. And that's what we see here, to come out into the wilderness. That's what John did. Go back to John chapter 1. One last thing as we finish up this introduction, I suppose, to John and his ministry. We see his selflessness, his purpose. But through and through, it's his humility. This man was humble. I'm not the Christ. He freely admitted it. I am not the Christ. And to compound that statement, he says this in verse 26 and verse 27. John answered them, I baptize you with water, but among you stands one you do not know, even he who comes after me, the strap of whose sandal I am not worthy to untie. Humility. John's ministry is marked with selflessness, intention, purpose, and humility. There's a man standing among you that I'm not even good enough to untie his shoes. That's a lot of humility from a man that is drawing crowds out of the city into the wilderness by the multitude, who is baptizing people in the Jordan River and over fist. And he says, there's somebody out there, I'm not even worthy to bend down and untie his shoes. And it's even more remarkable when you take this statement in verse 26 and verse 27 and you put it together with what is found in Matthew chapter 11, beginning in verse 2. And I'm just going to read through this very quickly. And just pay attention to what Jesus is saying in regards to John. Now, when John heard about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? Don't you think John knew that Jesus was the one? He had baptized him. He had seen the dove. He had heard the voice. Undoubtedly for his followers. Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? And Jesus answered them, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised, and the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me. Nearly verbatim, Isaiah chapter 61 and verse 1. As they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds concerning John. And this is what Jesus says about John. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Behold, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is he of whom it is written, Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1. Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. Truly, Matthew chapter 11, verse 11. Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist. There is no one greater than John the Baptist. Nobody has passed through human conception that is better than John the Baptist. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. What you have in John's ministry is marked with humility because he was the greatest, John says, prophet and human to live, but you have an exceptional opportunity. Do you see it in verse 11? The opportunity that you have in verse 11 is to be even greater than John. Because the opportunity that you have is to enter the kingdom of God, where the king is Jesus. You see, it all starts with this woman that didn't have any children, Elizabeth. She gave birth to the son that made straight the path of the Lord. And the Lord makes straight the path to heaven. That's where you come in. That's where I come in. Are you on the path to heaven? Are you following? Are you walking the straight and the narrow way? If you're not, I don't know why not. The risk is too severe to not be. But the reward is too good not to be.